Līga is a photography collection expert and an archivist at the National Library of Latvia. She is also a PhD student at the Art Academy of Latvia. Her research interest revolved around the social and cultural circulation of photography archives within memory institutions. Līga has a background in cultural anthropology and curatorship. She is the author of the book Photographies of Memories, which was published last year, which explores the biographies of postcards of the National Library of Latvia. Currently, she is conducting research on the archive of the Latvian photographer and artist Zenta Dzidvinska. It's a very difficult name to read, but this is what she's going to talk us about, focusing on the inclusion of women's archives in the history of Latvian photography. The floor is yours, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and I'm really, really happy to be here and really honored as well to be part of this. And I've been taking notes so far and really inspired by the talks I've heard. And as a librarian, I hope that I'll be able to bring some of the stories and names you've mentioned back to our library for our readers. So if you have any book suggestions, I'll be very happy to take more notes. And I'm excited to follow Sandra's paper because I feel that there are a lot of connection points also regarding methods and the theories. Perhaps I've used in my research as well. And I'm a PhD student in my second year, so this means that I'm still mapping my methods and my theories. So any suggestions and comments are very, very welcome, and I'll be happy to talk with you afterwards as well. So I'll begin with a story how I met the archive and how I started my research. It was before I started my PhD. And it was in 2021 when I was invited to consult on the preservation of an archive. It was a body of 13 banana boxes or moving boxes, the kind you have lying around in the attic. They were sealed with different types and colors of tape and signatures with a black marker pen that said ZDZ. ZDZ stands for Latvian artist and photographer Zenta Dzidvinska, one of the few women photographers of the Latvian photo club culture in the 1960s and 70s. In the boxes, there were neatly annotated negatives as well as deformed, rolled-up films packed in archival slips, paper napkins, and plastic bags. There were analog and digital prints with exhibition stamps and small prints with torn corners and mold and dust. Even family albums and office printer book dummies. Also candlesticks, a powder box, glasses, and childcare diaries. I was asked if I'd be interested to do a bit of systematization and organizing in an exhibition space and help an artist who would make prints from the negatives to exhibit and gradually fill the exhibition room with images that hadn't been seen before. A sort of performance amongst the visitors of the gallery, performing archiving. It became clear that during the 2 months of the exhibition, nothing much could be done without archival supplies. I could only learn the patterns of previous archivers and their choices in organizing the parts they sought to be of value. As I became more familiar with the contents of the boxes and spoke in depth with the owner of the archive, Dzidvinska's daughter, Alice Tiefenthal, who is also an art historian and photography researcher, I'm sure that many of you have met her and have know her as well. And during the exhibition, I spoke with the curator of the exhibition and artists doing the printing and also the visitors of the exhibition. And during these talks, many questions and affects started to arise and come up. And after the exhibition, Tiefenthal decided to donate her mother's archive to the National Library of Latvia, where I continued to systematize it, assist other researchers who work with her images, as well as write my own story on the circulation of this archive. The prologue of this paper marks a point in the archive's biography and my own biography where we met. And since then, I found myself pondering the very well-known question posed by Linda Nochlin over 50 years ago that was raised yesterday as well, and we discussed this after the discussion a bit as well, that it's fascinating that this question doesn't really get old. What changes, I guess, are the methods which we use to answer this question, and the context in which this question is raised. And I've been rephrasing it for my own research and asking, why have there been no great Latvian women photographers, and why has there been so little research done on the few that are known, and why are we so negligent in discovering new names, and why women who practiced photography during the Soviet period are hesitant to share their work and take up space in collections rooms and paragraphs in books of Latvian art and photography histories. Now, Nochlin raised her question in 1971 during the second wave of feminism in a Western context. A few years earlier, in a different context in Soviet-occupied Latvia, one that didn't have the clear feminist tradition the West had, Dzivedzinska, who was a young woman in her 20s, had completed her education at a secondary school of applied arts and had become a member of the Photo Club Riga. Amateur photo clubs at the time were one of the seldom state-approved fields for practicing art photography in the Soviet Union, and most of the participants were professionals in other areas and rarely had an art education background like Dzivedzinska. Although the Soviet political system claimed gender equality, the number of women photographers in the yearly exhibitions of the Photo Club Riga show an imbalance in favor of male participants. Out of more than 30 to 40 participants, only 2 to 7 were women. In addition, even fewer women had developed professional careers in photography during the Soviet occupation. And alas, no women from the Soviet period have been mentioned in the only book published so far on the history of Latvian photography. And Dzivedzinska appears only in a group photo. But I do have to mention that there is a new book on the way that's going to be published very soon this year, and that is revising this history with a contemporary reading. Now, regarding Dzivedzinska's life story, despite practicing photography for less than 10 years, she decided to step away from art photography and instead focus on working as a graphic designer to support herself and later her family. And for almost 2 decades, Dzivedzinska's archive lay dormant in an attic until it resurfaced in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when curators sought to discover the works of lesser-known photographers who did something differently than the decorative aesthetics influenced by the pictorial style practiced in the amateur clubs. And this brings us back to the questions. Where are the women photographers? Where are their archives and where are their stories? The ones who earned their living with photography, the ones who complied with the male gaze of photo club, and the ones who didn't, by focusing on documenting their surroundings. And the reason for this scattered narrative of the history of Latvian photography, as I argue in my research, is the lack of feminist discourse in Latvian art history research up until very recently, as well as neglecting photography as art, and the consequential lack of care, labor, practice, and strategies applied towards preserving women's archives. And in this paper, I will introduce my methodology. I draw upon critical theories with the case study of Dzivedzinska's archive. My methods are synthesized as I come from an interdisciplinary background in cultural anthropology, curatorial studies, and art history. I've studied and practiced photography and worked in several memory institutions holding photography archives, and these areas frame my research practice and storytelling. And with my case study of Dziedziniecka's archive, I propose a post-humanist feminist archiving methodology. The overarching meta-narrative of my research is my interest in gendered memory practices of art and photography, history, storytelling. And my work includes a self-reflective researcher's position, focusing on the biographies of archives, as well as integrating a feminist discourse within the institution currently holding the archive, that is the National Library of Latvia. And before I talk about activating care labor in narrating women's stories, I want to introduce the notion of biography of an archive. This is a research approach I've synthesized from Igor Kopitov's essay on the social biographies of things, Elizabeth Edwards' research on the materiality of photography, and applications of post-humanist ideas in museology. And I argue that archives, like people, have versatile biographies, for they are entangled in complex networks of performative relationships, both with human and non-human actants. Their status, roles, and possible trajectories shift and vary in relation to different contexts, positioning, and discourses of art and policies. And likewise, their vibrant agency affects other actants and settings they inhabit. It is essential to speak about biographies of archives and stories of women photographers. For the biographies of their archives, that is, their use, systematization, visibility, circulation, or even death in cases they are burnt, thrown out, or forgotten, allow us to trace the inequalities, segregations, missing links, as well as the overall unbalanced landscape of photography histories. I am still at an early stage of collecting data, still through conversations with photographers and their families. I've uncovered that in most of the cases there has been a total or partial hibernation of their archives. Photographers have mentioned not being sure if anyone is interested in their work and not being sure which photographs could be regarded as art photography, part of the history of photography, and which as personal archives. And some of them have voiced not being sure if their work is even good enough to be mentioned. So we see that there is this apathy and self-doubt, and how do we cure it to enable a polyphony of storytelling? And tending to women's stories and their neglected archives can be discussed through the notion of care. It sounds almost too easy, but the notion is complex in its socio-economical as well as political dimensions. It is not neutral, and it has its traditions of readings in feminist theories. And for this research, I refer to Maria Piu de la Bellacase, who introduces the term in more than human worlds, that is, towards objects, things, living beings, and organisms, and humans. And she writes, "Care is a human trouble, but this does not make of care a human-only matter." For Bellacase, care involves three dimensions: labor work, affect, affections, and ethics politics. And these can be entangled, but is not necessarily in all the cases. Care can be an attitude, a set of actions, as well as a strategy. And care can look like an initiative to systematize one's work by annotating it, a decision to donate the archive to a memory institution, and in some cases, including Dziedziniecka's, care labor is done by daughters tending to their mother's archives. Care can be practiced through affect, being inspired by another artist's work, like it is the case of Sophie Thun that I mentioned in the beginning when I met the archive. And in my research, I refer to care as an instrument or a tool which allows adapting a critical stance within patriarchal and hegemonic ways of photography storytelling. And something went off? Yeah, all good. And do notice that in this paper I'm not discussing images showing Dziedziniecka's style. I do, however, analyze images in other aspects of my research, but This aspect, in post-humanist terms, a methodology of care for curating women's archives, allows shifting focus from anthropocentric and image-centric research, that is, one artist and their most valuable works, to curatorial strategies, which allows engaging with the body of the archive and its biography to critique the power dynamics and hierarchies within art history and institutions and produce new knowledge. In the discussion on ambiguous private and public nature of diaries, Desiree Henderson talks about privatization of diaries or ego documents of marginalized people and groups. And if we look into Dziewiczyńska's series, House by the River, it is exactly the case of privatization as the simple documentary evidence of the lives of women, the elderly, and children, as well as intuitive and experimental approaches in depicting women, were not part of the art circulation, amateur photography aesthetics, or photography serving the state. An example of a recent care practice is the work of Polish-Austrian artist I mentioned in the beginning, Sophie Thun, as she took the role of Dziewiczyńska's lab technician and developed so far unseen photographs. She's a contemporary artist working with another artist's archive to produce new works and weave and entangle her archive with Dziewiczyńska's paying a tribute and opening a discussion on women's photography heritage. And thus, care in curatorial work is an instrument that allows the illumination of these privatized stories and enables a polyphony of voices and a playground for networks of interactions. The passage of time, retrospection, and memory in relation to amnesia are central to Dziewiczyńska's and other stories. The human agency, that is, the cognitive and embodied memory, doesn't have continuity in time if there are no material, social, and cultural agencies and mediations. For sociologist Maurice Holbach's memory is always mediated through body, materiality, objects, discourses, and language, and it allows the past to be reconstructed. The collective framework in which we live impacts how we write autobiographies and how we select which of our stories and photographs are important differs by generation. This applies not only to personal histories, but changing art history methodologies. And usually in humanities, ego documents are emphasized as testimonies, memoirs, letters, a written text with a storyline. But here I suggest turning to the materiality of the archive and its ability to hold stories through its reuse and resystematization. Dziewiczyńska did not leave a diary or a manuscript of her autobiography in turn. Since the 1990s, she worked intensively on annotating her archive and making selections of photographs that now had the space for exhibitions. She started the chain of care by engaging with her archive, and thus I turn to the archive as Dziewiczyńska's ego document. It lacks linearity, it is sometimes chaotic and unreadable, and integration into the collections of the National Library of Latvia pushes for a change in systematization. By erasing Dziewiczyńska's and her daughter's patterns of archiving, one might say that it's kind of a violence done to the archive and the body and the state it's in right now. But nevertheless, by applying the post-humanist archiving method and care as a strategy, the archive speaks and holds in its body Dziewiczyńska's autobiographical urge. She was the first archivist of her work, as she left notes and clues about her artistic choices, as well as clues about internalized insecurities, being a woman photographer. An ego document allows entering someone's memories. It makes them public as a representation of one's life. Penny Summerfield points out that the term ego document in feminist theories has critical readings, for the notion is tied to the 19th century philosophical thought of the self-reliant masculine ego. And she emphasizes that storytelling is interactive, relational, and collective, and it involves sharing. And while I agree completely with this argument, still, in the case of Dziewiczynska and other women photographers of the second half of the 20th century in Soviet-occupied nations, detachment from the male-dominated photo club aesthetics is key to narrating their neglected stories in a contemporary curatorial landscape. As Western traditions of one's life storytelling focuses on the individual experience. And this detachment is precisely what allows Dziewiczynska to conceptualize her story. She is part of a bigger community of amateur art photographers of a nation and shared history of a marginalized group. And simultaneously, as she tells her story, she is a part as a woman whose style wasn't acknowledged for 20 years to come. So the detached ego is necessary to take up space. And I want to finish with kind of an anecdotal epilogue. As I was writing a commission piece on one of the most beloved Latvian press photographers, Uldis Brauns, regarded highly for its humorous wit and stance against the Soviet regime, I came across an article titled "Being a Woman." In this article, Brauns and the journalist discuss how women lack the necessary characteristics to spend long hours with the technically complex medium, but still they concluded that there is beauty in each woman's character and individuality, and one has to look carefully to uncover it. This article is way too anecdotal and illustrative in reducing women to beautiful subjects, objectified in front of a camera rather than having agency as equal practitioners holding the camera. But something stands out, and it is the aspect of care, I guess. Instead of being seen as an image and potential for aesthetic pleasure, being a woman in photography unfolds complicated layers of gendered memory practices that shape the writing of art and photography histories. And archives are ego documents that take up space and are spaces themselves for memory work. Their vibrancy is engaging and they speak to tell stories. And indeed, one has to look carefully and be full of care whilst engaging with them. Thank you very much.